Naturally blood red lips? That is alarming. Hello y'all, welcome back to Case Can Probably Read. My name is Casey and I probably can. It is time for my December reading wrap up. I meant to do this like a couple of weeks ago, but then I also wanted to read up to the very wire for 2021, and then I also caught the flu, so I'm just now getting to it. This month really started out as a slog for me. I had major reading fatigue at the beginning of December. The first 2 weeks of it were just me kind of like aimlessly grasping at different titles and trying to find something that I had the will to finish. It was a very difficult start to my month, but I did manage to get some books read. I got into it and I knocked out 6 more books. I think that brings my overall year total to 72 books for 2021. And I'm really proud of that. Not going to talk anymore about it because I've already talked about it enough. 72 books is a good number for me. All right. So I think we'll just jump right into what I actually read. Stop zooming in, computer. So if you will recall, in November's reading wrap up, I read the Book of Three, which is by Lloyd Alexander. And it is the first one in a series of 5 books that are part of the Chronicles of Dade. At that time, I said, and I quote, "I don't know if I really liked it that much. I think if I were a younger reader, I would have liked this a lot. But for me, the pacing is just a little funny. It's slow and then fast. I don't know if I'm going to finish the series. There's 4 more books in it. That's really all I have to say about that one." So the first thing that I did this month was finish 2 more books in that series. I read The Black Cauldron, which is the second one, and I read The Castle of Llyr, which is the third one in the series. I had already checked out the books and the audiobooks from the library because they were short, and I think it was right around Thanksgiving when I checked them out, so I thought I would knock them out no problem. And then I read the Book of Three and I just wasn't really impressed, and I thought I wasn't going to read any more of them. But then we got 2 weeks into December and I still hadn't finished a book, and I started to panic. And I thought, no matter how I feel about these books, they're short enough that I could get through them if I at least listened to the audiobook. So that's what I did. Actually, I'm really glad that I did. The audiobooks were really well done, and the stories actually started to grow on me. Taryn, who is the main character from these stories, he is still hot-headed and impulsive, a lot like he was in the Book of Three, but he is showing character growth in the next 2. He is starting to grow up and make wiser decisions, which is what I want for my children's and my middle grade. I want them to learn things. I really like that Llyr gets quite a bit of screen time. If you'll recall, she was the princess from the first one. She's one of the only female characters in the whole book, but she does get quite a bit of screen time, and very rarely does she ever get counted out of the action or the heroics simply because she's a girl, which is something that I really appreciate about these stories. She always shows up and makes sure that she finds a place for herself in the action, even if nobody is going to just hand it to her. In fact, she usually has to like show up and say, "Oh, you tried to leave me at home, but here I am. I'm coming anyway." And I really like that about Llyr and her character in this story. There's actually really good stakes in these books, at least in the first 3. Without going into too many spoilers, people be dying. And it's good. It's good death. It's the kind, I feel like it's the kind that shows you that things can be lost. Not everything is just going to be handed to the heroes. These carry a lot for books for young readers, I feel like, and I feel like they're well done. And I am glad that I continued into the next 2. I need to take a little bit of a break, but I do want to finish the last 2 in the series, which are Terran Wanderer and The High King. Hopefully I will be getting into those in the next month or two and telling you a little bit about them. Anyhow, I ended up rating The Black Cauldron 3.7 stars according to my own personal rubric, which I rounded up to a 4 on Goodreads. And I ended up rating The Castle of Llyr 4 stars, both personally and on Goodreads. On to the next book I read this month, which was Magic Bitter, Magic Sweet by Charlie N. Holmberg. Charlie Holmberg is kind of a palate cleanser for me. When I'm going through a slump, I usually can pick out something from her backlog that will help boost me through that slump. My favorites that she has written are the Paper Magician trilogy. I think I've got it up there somewhere. Yeah, right there. The Fifth Doll and followed by Frost. I will say though that of the books I've read by Charlie and Holmberg, Magic Bitter, Magic Sweet was probably my least favorite. I started it back in September, I want to say, sometime around then, and right out of the gate, it did not grab me. I got about 25% of the way through the book, and then I just kind of left it. I let it sit in my Kindle library for 3 months. After I finished The Black Cauldron and The Castle of Llyr, I had another DNF right out of the gate, and I was worried that I was going to sink back into a slump. So I decided to go back into my Kindle library and look at some of the books that I'd started but didn't finish, and that I didn't outright hate as soon as I started them, and ones that I just kind of lost interest in. And I hoped that I could pick up one of those and use the momentum I had from finishing those last 2 books to kind of sling me through to the end of another book. So I picked this one. When I got about 40% of the way through the book, I got really excited because it developed in such a way that I thought it was going to turn into a fairy tale retelling. But I was wrong. It did include some fairy tale elements, but it never turned into a true fairy tale retelling, which was kind of a bummer. It never purported to be a fairy tale retelling. That's on me. I was just disappointed. One of the reasons I like Charlie Holmberg so much is her magic systems and her worlds. Usually I find her worlds very rich and magical. She usually has interesting heroines. Usually whichever vehicle she uses for bringing magic into her worlds are really unique and original. The hero of this particular story is named Llyr. She has an ability to use magic in her baking. She can infuse her bakes with emotions and traits, things like hope or fortitude, strength or wisdom. She starts the story living in a small town with her found family. She can't remember anything from her life before she came to the town, but she believes that she is in her mid-20s. The story kind of kicks off when her town is attacked by marauders and she's sold into slavery to work for a man named Alamus. She starts being visited by this ghost guy with wings who's named Fael, and he begins to reveal things to her about her past. Okay. By the time I got about 75% of the way through the story, I still didn't really have enough information about Lyr's past. We had no idea why she had her baking ability and what it really had to do with the story at large. And the end of the book was just out there. It was too out there for me. It was sad and cosmic and confusing. I don't know what else to tell you. It just really didn't do it for me. I personally rated this one 3.2 stars, which was a Goodreads 3 stars. The 4th book that I read this month was actually a reread. I read Fairest by Gail Carson Levine. When I was in middle school, Gail Carson Levine was the shiz. Ella Enchanted was one of my favorite books in middle school, followed closely by Fairest. Fairest is a fairy tale retelling, which I eat up like Snow White eats poison apples, like Hansel and Gretel eat the witch's gingerbread house, like Prince Lindworm eats maidens. I like them. Fairest is a fairy tale retelling of Snow White. In it, the protagonist is named Aza. She's abandoned as a child, but a family of innkeepers takes her in and raises her as one of their own. This is one of my favorite things about this story. Fairy tales are flooded with descriptions of damsels who have hair as black as a raven's wing, skin as white as snow or milk, and lips as red as rubies or blood. And in the stories, everyone always thinks that's beautiful, that they are beautiful. Do you have any idea how startling someone who actually looks like that would be? Naturally blood red lips? That is alarming. And in Fairest, Ozza is described the same way, but nobody thinks she's beautiful. On the contrary, she is considered ugly. But she has a beautiful voice, almost bordering on magical, and through a surprising turn of events, she ends up attending the royal wedding and becoming the lady-in-waiting to the queen. The rest of the story unfolds in what I think is a fresh way compared to the fairy tale. I enjoyed it then, I enjoyed it now. I personally rated it 4.4 stars, which became a 4 stars on Goodreads. Which brings us to the 5th book I read this month, which was Spoiler Alert by Olivia Dade. Olivia Dade. I'm not sure how you say it. Spoiler Alert is a contemporary romance. It's supposed to have a lot of niche interest for the geek world. Anybody who's really interested in fan fiction or in cosplay or just in being part of a fandom at all, this book is kind of supposed to be for them. It's also a plus-size romance, so one of the characters involved in this romance is a plus-sized woman. Okay, so the story starts with an actor named Marcus Castor Rupp. He plays a character called Aeneas on a famous TV show called Gods of the Gates, which I think is supposed to be similar to Game of Thrones. Marcus wasn't happy with how the show was going and how unfaithful it is to the original books it was based on, so he started writing Gods of the Gates fan fiction anonymously in order to vent his frustration. And it's assumed that if his showrunners ever found out he was writing fan fiction about the show, that he would be fired from his acting job. The other protagonist is April Whittier. She is a plus-size geologist who also writes Gods of the Gates fan fiction anonymously and is unknowingly online friends with Marcus. She decides to live her truth and posts a picture of herself in Gods of the Gates cosplay on Twitter. Some people are supportive, but it's Twitter, so there are also assholes who fat shame her. Marcus happens to see this happening. He comes to her rescue by asking her out on a date on Twitter to prove all the assholes wrong. So she says yes, and they go on a date and end up starting a relationship, and the rest of the story unfolds as romances do. Y'all, okay, here's what it is. Here's the deal. Ugh. I'm a plus-size woman. I expected to like this book. I was like, yeah, let the big girl win. But it was poorly done. I think the author really wanted to show how emotionally mature and sensitive the two characters were, that April was a strong, confident woman who was conquering her hangups about her body, and that Marcus was this super emotionally in tune ally who just gets consent and personal boundaries and space. It just didn't play that way. And there was a ton of that miscommunication trope nonsense in there. Is that what it's called? You know, the one where there wouldn't be a book if the characters had an adult conversation? Yeah, that one. I'm fine if it's part of the book, but this pretty much felt like all of the book. Anyway, I still learned a lot. Like, I learned who Nikolai Coster-Waldau is. I had no idea who that guy was before I read about the main character of this, Marcus Castor Rupp. What a crazy coincidence. And I also learned what the word twee means, because I think this book might be twee. A lot of people really seem to like this book. And maybe if you are really into fan fiction, this could be a fun read for you. But I've never really been into that world, and the story and the execution were a real swing and a miss for me. Like, I think I'm finally over romances, at least for a while. This one rounded up to a 3 for me on Goodreads. And that's all I have to say about it. All right, the last book that I read this month was Godland by Lyz Lenz. Lyz Lenz is a reporter and a writer. I don't usually do this, but I'm actually just going to read you the book blurb because it's the fastest way to convey to you what the book is about so I can comment on it. It says, in the wake of the 2016 election, Lyz Lenz watched as her country and her marriage were torn apart by the competing forces of faith and politics. A mother of 2, a Christian, a lifelong resident of Middle America, Lenz was bewildered by the pain and loss around her, the empty churches and the broken hearts. What was happening to faith in the heartland? From drugstores in Sydney, Iowa, to skeet shooting in rural Illinois, to the mega churches of Minneapolis, Lenz set out to discover the changing forces of faith and tradition in God's country. Part journalism, part memoir, Godland is a journey into the heart of a deeply divided America. Lenz visits places of worship across the heartland and speaks to the everyday people who often struggle to keep their churches afloat and to cope in a land of instability. Through a thoughtful interrogation of the effects of faith and religion on our lives, our relationships, and our country, Godland investigates whether our divides can ever be bridged and if America can ever come together. I needed to read this book in a way that I haven't needed to read a book in a long time. I wish I could explain to people what it was like to live in the southern United States in 2016 and how so often it felt like I was just holding on to my faith with both my hands. We would go to church and we would feel so alone. I grew up in mostly white communities. Most of the people that I went to church with were white. I didn't even think about the color of my skin when I was at church because we were just Christians. I didn't start thinking about it until after the 2016 election. Then I started noticing how differently I thought about things than the people who sat next to me in our pews. I noticed how they would post the most hateful stuff on social media about people who looked like me. And there always seemed to be a real disconnect between what they thought of immigrants and people of color and what they thought about me sitting next to them on the pew. There were so many times when I thought that maybe I could show them, that maybe if I could lovingly show them what their words were doing to me, maybe that would convince them that that isn't how Christians talk, that that isn't how God loves. But unfortunately, I don't think we ever got there. My husband and I left traditional ministry in 2019, and while we still do identify as Christians, our faith looks radically different than it did in 2016. It looks radically different than it did even at the start of the pandemic. This book put all of that into words for me. It didn't really offer solutions, but it did offer me hope that maybe things are changing, that maybe one day it won't be so difficult to call myself a Christian, knowing what Christians look like to the rest of the world. And maybe one day we'll be able to carve out a space of belief for ourselves where we don't feel like we have to be silent in order to get to sit inside a church sanctuary. I'm really looking forward to that day. I think in the future, I'd like to do a video just on deconstruction and reconstruction of faith and books that I read that really helped me to deal with this season of our lives. When I do that, I'd like to take a deeper dive into what Godland was about, but that takes a lot of emotional energy and I don't have that right now. So let it suffice to say that I unreservedly rated this book 5 stars, even though it mentioned hot dish way too many times. I didn't even know that hot dish was a Midwesterner thing. And not to be offensive, but it just feels like a really weird thing to get all proud about. Just call it a casserole like the rest of us, okay? Well, that's all I got for you today. Looking forward to what the new year has in store for us. 2021 was slightly better than 2020, so maybe 2022 will be slightly better than 2021. We'll climb our way out of this decade a year at a time. If my brand of awkward appeals to you, please feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, go look up what twee means. Bye.